Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We're going to be looking at the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, but that's part of our continuing study in the life of Christ. But first, we're going to get Jesus up to the vicinity of Jerusalem. When we left off, we saw in Luke chapter 19, verse 28, after he had said these things, he was going on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. He's leaving Jericho now, and he's making this last trip up to Jerusalem. But before he gets there, he gets to the neighboring town of Bethany. And we have three accounts of this. Matthew, Mark, and Luke I've put side by side. In Matthew's account, we read, "Now when Jesus was in Bethany at the home of Simon the leper, a woman came to him with an alabaster vial of very costly perfume, and she poured it on his head as he reclined at the table." Mark gives the same account while he was in Bethany at the home of Simon the leper. Notice both those are mentioned. And reclining at the table, there came a certain woman with an alabaster vial, a very costly perfume of nard. Tells us what the perfume was, and she broke the vial and poured it over his head. Luke's account, notice in Luke's account, he puts it not at the end, as Jesus is arriving in Bethany, about to go to his crucifixion, but Luke places it earlier in the story. Now, I've noted that when two or more authors give the same story in the same terms, they are describing the same story, and perhaps they're borrowing one for another. But sometimes the information is arranged topically rather than chronologically. Matthew and Mark put it at the end because now we're going to talk about those things near Jerusalem. But Luke chapter 7, that's very early in Luke's narrative, chapter 7, verse 37, there was a woman in the city who was a sinner. We don't read about her being a sinner in Matthew 26 or Mark 14. She was a sinner when she learned that he was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house. Simon the leper is not mentioned. She bought an alabaster vial of perfume. And the question is Matthew and Mark telling the same story as Luke, or is this a different event? Well, when we look at John's account, John chapter 12, again it puts it as Jesus finally comes from this last trip up to Jerusalem, but just before you get to Jerusalem, you get to Bethany. Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving. That's what Martha does. We saw that over in Luke's account too. They would have dinner, and Martha would be the serving one. But Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Mary then took a pound of very costly perfume. We did not read her name in either Matthew, Mark, or Luke, if those all three are giving the same account. I tend to think they probably are. But here it's Mary who took a pound of very costly perfume of pure nard and anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. So here we find out who it is, that it's Mary who is doing this. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples who was intending to betray him, notice the plan and the plot is already underway in the heart of Judas. I'm not sure if he's contacted others yet, but he's looking for an opportunity. And he says, why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii? That's a huge amount of money. A common day laborer might be expected to receive 1 denarii for his labors of a single day. So this is basically a year's worth of work for a common day laborer. That's what it would cost to purchase this vial of perfume. Why was this not sold for 300 denarii and given to poor people? Now he said this not because he was concerned about the poor, but because he was a thief, and as he had the money box, he used to pilfer what was put into it. Judas, his heart was that of a thief. Therefore Jesus said, let her alone, so that she may keep it for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. Jesus is going to his death. He knows he is going to his death. And this act of extravagant worship is allowed and it is praised. Now, the large crowd of the Jews then learned that he was there. That is, he was in Bethany. And they came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus. Now, we look back in John chapter 11, Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead, and that's what's mentioned here, whom he raised from the dead. Verse 10, but the chief priests planned to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him many of the Jews were going away and were believing in Jesus. People have been believing in Jesus, and so not only do they want to put Jesus to death, they're seeking maybe to even put Lazarus back in the grave. He had been raised, he had already died once, and Jesus had raised him. They think, well, if he's died once, he can die again. And they're looking to put him to death. Finally, we come to Jerusalem. When you get to Jerusalem, and here for this picture we're standing on the top of the Mount of Olives overlooking the city, the first thing that you see today is that beautiful gold dome, the Dome of the Rock, standing where in ancient times the temple once stood. As I'm over in Mark chapter 11 verses 1 through 3, as they approached Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany, these are the two twin cities just on the other side of the Mount of Olives, near the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples and said to them, go into the village opposite you. If it was Bethany, maybe they went to Bethphage, I'm not sure. But go into the village opposite you, and immediately as you enter it, you will find a colt tied there, on which no one yet has ever sat. Untie it and bring it here. If anyone says to you, why are you doing this? You say, the Lord has need of it, and immediately he will send it back here. Notice he's exercising the rights and prerogative of a visiting king. Visiting kings, they own everything, and so they can go and say, I have need of your horse, I have need of your house, I have need of whatever it is, and it is to be given. And Jesus has need of this colt. Now they're going to get it back again. He's not going to be a horse thief, but he is going to make use of it. They went away and found a colt tied at the door outside the street, and they untied it. And sure enough, some of the bystanders were standing, saying to them, "What are you doing untying the colt?" And they spoke to him just as Jesus had told them, and they gave them permission. So all the instructions of Jesus are carried out. And they brought the colt to Jesus and put their coats on it, and he sat on it. And I think that's rather striking, because in my younger days, I remember one time we were kids, we were up in my grandfather's farm, and they had an unbroken horse, an unbroken colt. He wasn't like a little tiny thing. He was in his prime, but he had never been ridden before. And my younger brother and I decided, well, we'll try to ride him. And I jumped up on the back of this unbroken colt, young horse, and it was a very short ride. It lasted for maybe about 5 seconds, and then he found a way to quickly have me removed from his back. I think it's striking here that this colt carries Jesus without needing to be broken. Well, many spread their coats in the road, and others spread leafy branches which they had cut from the fields, and they have an entry for Jesus, the like of which you would normally give to a visiting king. This is his entry. He is coming in as though he were a king. And those who were in front and those who followed were shouting, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David. Hosanna in the highest." These are quotes from the Psalms and quotes from the Old Testament, and they are praising the Lord for this coming king. Psalm chapter 118, verse 24. Is one of those psalms of ascent that you would typically sing as you were coming to Jerusalem for the Passover. Here it is. "This is the day which the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. O Lord, do save." Now the way you say that in Hebrew is, "O Lord, Hosanna." Do save, we beseech you. O Lord, we beseech you, do send prosperity. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. We have blessed you from the house of the Lord. So they're using the scriptures. They're using this psalm of ascents, which would typically be sung at this time, but they're using it to honor and to usher Jesus into the city. The psalm goes on. If we looked at the next two verses, it goes on to say, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. It's a preview of things to come, and this is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. If they had read the rest of the psalm, they might have recognized what was going to take place in Jerusalem. Well, Jesus entered Jerusalem. This is Mark chapter 11, verse 11, and came into the temple, and after looking around at everything, he left for Bethany with the 12, since it was already late. So he has this entry in Jerusalem. He comes to the temple. He looks around. He turns around, and he leaves, and he goes back to Bethany. Now, John chapter 12, verses 12 and 13, on the next day, the large crowd who had come to the feast, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, took the branches of the palm trees, it sounds a little bit like what we just read, went out to meet him, and began to shout, Hosanna, blessed is him who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. Jesus, finding a young donkey, sat on it, as it is written. And this time, John's account connects this not to the Psalms, but to a different prophecy, a prophecy in Zechariah. And this prophecy says, Fear not, daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming, seated on a donkey's colt. These things his disciples did not understand at the first. But when Jesus was glorified, they heard it, they sort of went with the experience. But then after the death, the burial, the resurrection, the glorification of Jesus, then they remembered that these things were written of him. They remembered that was back, it was echoed in the Old Testament, and that they had done these things to him. Now, Luke's account, as soon as he was approaching near the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of the disciples began to praise God joyfully with a loud voice for all the miracles which they had seen, shouting, Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory in the highest. We have a number of different accounts, each one describing the same event. And so here Jesus comes now to Jerusalem, comes down the Mount of Olives, and then up the Temple Mount. It's a big steep valley. On the picture, you really can't tell quite how steep it is. It really is. And then he comes up to arrive finally at the temple in Jerusalem. Now, some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. They're going too much. They're saying too much. But Jesus answered, I tell you, if these become silent, the stones will cry out. There's just something striking about the coming of the Messiah. All creation has to cry out, and the people have to cry out. Then he approached Jerusalem, and he saw the city, and wept over it, saying, If you had known in this day, even you, the things which make for peace, but now they've been hidden from your eyes. As he comes to Jerusalem, he weeps over the city. 1,000 years earlier, there had been another king who had not come, but had left Jerusalem, King David, and had come up to the same Mount of Olives, and had wept over the city. And now here is the king, the greater David, coming back to the city, and he weeps over the city. Oh, if you'd only known. If you'd only known. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will throw up a barricade against you, and surround you and hem you in on every side, and they will level you to the ground and your children within you, and they will not leave in you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation. The words of Jesus, these prophetic words, will be literally fulfilled in the year AD 70. a mere 40 years after Jesus utters these words, the Romans are going to come up against the city of Jerusalem. They will throw up a barricade. They will build a wall around all the walls of Jerusalem. Surround the city, starve it out for a period of about 8 months, finally break into the city on the 9th of Av in the summertime of the year 70, and they will level the city to the ground. They will destroy the temple so utterly that scholars argue today, 2,000 years later, about exactly where the temple was located. Some folks say, well, it was over here, and some folks say, oh, no, it's over there, and because the temple will be utterly destroyed. Why? Because they did not recognize the coming of the Lord when he came. So the people, and I'm over in John chapter 12, verses 17 and 18. So the people who were with him when he called Lazarus out of the tomb and raised him from the dead continued to testify about him. You know, the news continues to be spread about. For this reason also the people went and met him because they had heard that he had performed the sign. That's the sign that had really gotten the attention of people. So the Pharisees said to one another, you see that you are not doing any good. Look, the world has gone after him. And they are recognizing the popularity of Jesus. Verse 20, now there were some Greeks among those who were going up to worship at the feast. These then came to Philip. Now, Philip was one of the disciples of Jesus. He happens to have a Greek name. Philip is a Greek name, and so they come to this, he's a Jewish disciple, but he's got a Greek name, who was from Bethsaida of Galilee. We saw Philip way back in John chapter 1, and began to ask him, saying, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. And Philip comes and gets Andrew, because Andrew, every time we see Andrew, Andrew's always bringing somebody to Jesus. So Philip goes and tells Andrew, and Andrew and Philip came and told Jesus. And Jesus answered them, saying, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. What we've seen Jesus say in the past, my hour has not yet come. But now it has come. Verse 24, truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Just like a grain, a seed has to go into the ground, a grain has to go into the ground, and then it grows. So he has to go into the ground, and then this entire kingdom is going to grow. Verse 25, he who loves his life loses it, and the one who hates his life in this world will keep it to life eternal. But it has to start with Jesus himself. If anyone serves me, he must follow me. And where I am, there my servant will be also. Jesus is going to go to the grave, and his followers also are going to be persecuted. Many will be killed. And all of them must be, can I say it this way? All of them must be crucified with Christ. Not necessarily literally, but they must all be united to him. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. Verse 27, now my soul has become troubled. And what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, but for this purpose I came for this hour. Jesus had come to die, and now he's approaching that death to die for us. Father, he prays, glorify your name. And no sooner has he said that than a voice came out of heaven saying, I have both glorified it and will glorify it again. So the crowd of people who stood by and heard it were saying that it had thundered. And others said, well, no, an angel has spoken. What was that? See, not all could make it out. Apparently there were some that could, because we have a recording of it here. Jesus answered and said, this voice has not come for my sake, but for your sakes. And now judgment is upon this world. Now the ruler of this world will be cast out. When's that going to happen? It's going to happen at the cross. Judgment is coming, and it will fall on him. Satan will be defeated. The ruler of this world will be cast out. And I, if I am lifted up from the earth, verse 32, will draw all men to myself, even Greeks. Remember, this is all said on the instance of Greeks being brought to meet Jesus. Verse 33, but he was saying this to indicate the kind of death by which he was to die. He's going to die by being lifted up. He will die by being crucified upon a cross. The crowd then answered him, we've heard out of the law that the Christ is to remain forever. Jesus has just been talking about his death, about being lifted up. We've heard out of the law that the Christ is to remain forever, and how can you say the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? Are we talking about two separate? You're going to die, and then the Christ is going to be reigning? How does that all work? You see, their eschatology was incomplete. They had lots of pieces, but they didn't know how it all put together. There's a lesson here about eschatology. It's the primary lesson that I use, the primary principle that I use in interpreting biblical prophecy. Here it is. That biblical prophecy is always easier to understand after it has been fulfilled. And even then, it's not always all that easy. So if it has not been fulfilled yet, be a little careful about being too dogmatic. You can get into lots of trouble that way. Because when you have the pieces, you don't always know how it is going to be put together until it takes place. Well, Jesus said to them, for a little while longer the light is among you. Walk while you have the light, so that darkness will not overtake you. He who walks in the darkness does not know where he goes. Verse 36, while you have the light, believe in the light, so that you may become sons of light. And these things Jesus spoke, and he went away and hid himself from them. It's a call to walk in the light rather than in the darkness, because the darkness is going to come. And if you're in the light, and if you hold on to the light, then you'll have that light even when dark days come. But though he had performed so many signs before them, yet they were not believing in him. Now there had been a measure of faith, there had been a positive response to Jesus on the part of some, but it only went so far. They were not believing him. Verse 38, this was to fulfill the word of Isaiah the prophet, which he spoke. Lord, this is Isaiah chapter 53, Lord, who has believed our report? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For this reason they could not believe. Another passage from Isaiah is going to be quoted. For Isaiah said again, he has blinded their eyes, and he hardened their hearts, so they would not see with their eyes, and perceive with their heart, and be converted, and I heal them. A blindness had come to make that unbelief permanent. And these things Isaiah said because he saw his glory, and he spoke of him. Isaiah had spoken looking forward to the coming of Messiah, looking forward to the glory of Jesus, and had predicted the unbelief that would accompany that coming. Nevertheless, many even of the rulers believed in him. Notice there's unbelief, but there's also belief. There's those who don't believe, and their hearts are hardened, their eyes are blinded by God because they didn't believe. Now their unbelief becomes that much more firm. But on the other hand, there are those that did believe, even of the rulers. But because of the Pharisees, they were not confessing him. They were believing, but they were silent believers. They were Christians, but they were Secret Service Christians, for fear that they would be put out of the synagogue. They did not want to lose their standing in the religious establishment. Why? Verse 43, for they loved the approval of men rather than the approval of God. What do you love? Do you want to be approved by men, or do you want to be approved by God? They don't always go together. Jesus cried out and said, he who believes in me does not believe in me, but in him who sent me. You see, if you believe in Jesus, it's not just Jesus, you're believing in the Father. Verse 45, he who sees me sees the one who sent me. I have come as a light into the world so that everyone who believes in me will not remain in darkness. When you come to Jesus, you find that you've come to the Father. When you come to Jesus, you find that you can see the Father all the much more. If anyone hears my sayings and does not keep them, I do not judge him. For I did not come to judge the world, but to save the world. This is what we read back in John chapter 3, verse 17. He who rejects me and does not receive my sayings has one who judges him. The word I spoke is what will judge him at the last day. In other words, he's already judged himself. For I did not speak on my own initiative, but the Father himself who sent me has given me a commandment as to what to say and what to speak. Jesus is not acting independently of the Father. He's acting in unity, in conjunction with the Father. Verse 50, I know that his commandment is eternal life. Therefore, the things I speak just as the Father has told me. Now, on the next day, I'm switching over to Mark chapter 11, verses 12 and 13. On the next day when they had left Bethany, remember he had come first to the temple on the previous day, and he had come into the temple and looked at it and then turned around and left. On the next day when they had left Bethany, he became hungry. And seeing at a distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if perhaps he would find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. Now, the fig tree is going to be an example. This isn't just about fig trees, although that's what's there. That's what's going to serve as sort of the living parable, the visual aid, the visual example. And he said to it, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And his disciples were listening. Wow, it looked like Jesus was having this isn't it, but it looked like, a temper tantrum, and he's cursing the fig tree. And he does that, but it's a picture of something else. And then they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who were selling doves. And he would not permit anyone to carry merchandise through the temple. What had happened, you have the temple, and if you'll notice, there is a low wall around the inner courts. You've got the temple itself on the left, that big structure, and then you have those high walls around it, both immediately around the temple, where you have the court of the priests and the court of the men, and then on our left, that would be to the east, you had the court of the women, and doors and gates all throughout. But then surrounding that whole complex, there was a low wall about 3 to 4 feet high, and every so often it had a gate, and at these gates were signs saying no Gentile beyond this point, upon pain of death. And it was outside this gate, in this vast open area you're still in the Temple Mount, still this big compound with the porch that you see in the distance, surrounding that entire Temple Mount with its colonnades. This outer area was known as the court of the Gentiles, and it was here that you would traditionally have the buying and the selling, the money changers, and this had turned into a big business. And Jesus comes in, and those who were buying and selling and using the temple also as a shortcut. If you just you want to come into Jerusalem, you're coming from the east, rather than make a big circuit around the wall, you would just do a quick shortcut through the temple. They were treating the temple as if it was just business as usual, instead of treating it as a holy place consecrated to God. And he began to teach and say to them, is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for the nations? But you have made it a robber's den. Notice it was to be a house of prayer not just for the Jews, but for the nations. Particularly that part that was dedicated to the court of the Gentiles, the court of the nations. That is the part that they had been using for their own money making. And you have made it, he says, a robber's den. Not only are you buying and selling, you're overcharging, you're stealing, you're actually conducting thievery in the very house of God. Now the chief priests and the scribes heard this, and began seeking how to destroy him, for they were afraid of him, for the whole crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they would go out of the city. So here he comes, he cleanses the temple, he teaches for a time, and then as evening falls, he leaves the temple and goes back out.